The first time my ex-husband threatened me, he was still wearing the wedding ring I bought him for our 10th anniversary. He stood outside my apartment door close to midnight, rain soaking through his dress shirt, staring at me like I was somebody he didn't recognize anymore. "If they investigate this," he said, "you better remember your name's attached to those accounts too." For a second, I thought I might throw up, because until then, I still believed the worst thing Emmanuel had done to me was cheat, not use me. And the part that still bothers me sometimes is knowing my son was asleep 10 feet away while his father stood there trying to decide whether I was somebody he needed to scare or somebody he needed to destroy. Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every day. If this is your first time watching, comment below with where you're watching from and subscribe to officially join the family. Most mornings back then started with Julia standing in the kitchen trying to make numbers behave. Not huge numbers either. Grocery numbers, gas numbers, the kind that shouldn't have mattered as much as they did considering how much Emmanuel made. She stood at the counter with her phone calculator open beside a stack of coupons while bread toasted behind her. "Mom, we're out of the good chips again," Caleb called from the living room. "You said that yesterday." "Because we were out yesterday too. You'll survive." "I don't think I will." Julia smiled, despite herself. "Check the pantry above the microwave." A second later, she heard cabinet doors slam around. Nope, only the healthy ones. Then yes, definitely tragic. Caleb wandered into the kitchen dragging his backpack by one strap. 8 years old at the time, skinny knees, cowlick in the back of his hair that never stayed down no matter how much water she used. He grabbed half a banana off the counter and made a face. "Why's it brown?" "Because bananas age, Caleb. That's gross. People age too. That's grosser." Before Julia could answer, footsteps came down the stairs. Emmanuel entered already dressed for work in gray slacks and a white button-down, one hand holding his phone while the other adjusted his watch. He smelled faintly like shaving cream and coffee. "Morning," Julia said. Not rude exactly, just distracted. He walked straight to the coffee machine, eyes still on his screen. Julia slid a plate toward him. "I made eggs. I've got a breakfast meeting. You should still eat something." I said I've got a breakfast meeting. There wasn't any sharpness in his voice, but there was enough impatience packed into it that the room changed anyway. Caleb looked down at the counter. Julia reached over and took the plate back without saying anything. That was the thing about tension inside long marriages. Sometimes it wasn't yelling. Sometimes it was tiny adjustments people made automatically so the morning could keep moving. Emmanuel finally looked up from his phone. "You pay the water bill." "Yesterday." "Okay." Then back to the screen again. Julia packed Caleb's lunch while Emmanuel drank coffee standing at the kitchen island scrolling through emails. At least she assumed they were emails. Some mornings, he talked about work, nonstop. Other mornings he acted like home was a hotel lobby he needed to pass through efficiently. Outside, their subdivision looked exactly like the kind of neighborhood people envied online. Curved sidewalks, fresh mulch around the mailboxes, kids riding bikes in circles after school, while parents waved from driveways holding insulated tumblers. Every December, Julia wrapped garland around the porch railings herself because Emmanuel said holiday decorating was basically setting money on fire, but he still smiled in every picture afterward. That part used to bother her more than she admitted. The pictures always looked warm. Matching pajamas on Christmas morning, pumpkin patch photos in October, lake vacation selfies where Emmanuel rested a hand on her shoulder like a man deeply connected to his family. People commented things like, "Goals. You guys are the cutest family. Marriage done right." Julia read those comments sometimes while sitting alone in the living room after Caleb went to bed. Not because she believed them exactly, more because she wanted to. Emmanuel grabbed his keys off the counter. "You using the debit card today?" Julia looked up. "Probably." "How much?" She blinked once. "I don't know. Groceries?" "I'm serious." "So am I." He exhaled through his nose. "We went over budget last month. It was Caleb's school stuff and your mom's birthday dinner." "I'm aware." Something about that answer irritated her immediately. Not enough for a fight. Just enough to leave a mark on the conversation. Julia zipped Caleb's lunchbox harder than necessary. Sometimes Emmanuel talked about money like he was the only person carrying responsibility for it. Even after all these years, he still referred to bills as things he handled instead of things they handled. It hadn't always been that way, or maybe it had, and she noticed it slower than she should have. Back before Caleb was born, Julia worked front desk administration at a dental office in Middletown. Nothing glamorous, but she liked having her own paycheck. Liked buying coffee without mentally reporting it to someone. Then daycare costs hit. Then Caleb got sick constantly his first year. Then Emmanuel got promoted. One practical decision turned into another. "You're barely bringing home enough to cover childcare anyway," Emmanuel had told her back then, while sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by spreadsheets. "This just makes more sense." At the time she agreed. Honestly, it did make sense financially, at least on paper. But somewhere over the years, practical slowly became dependent, and dependent turned into asking permission for things that used to belong to both of them equally. Not openly. Emmanuel never said she needed permission. He just controlled information. Investment accounts stayed mostly under his name because it was cleaner for taxes. Retirement planning became conversations full of terms Julia stopped fully understanding. Even the house paperwork leaned heavily on Emmanuel's credit history and employment records. Whenever she asked questions, he answered them fast, confidently, sometimes too fast. "You worry too much," he'd say, or, "I already handled it." And because she trusted him, that usually ended the conversation. Marriage, to Julia, meant somebody was carrying things with you, not preparing separate exits. Emmanuel checked his watch. "I'm gonna be late." Caleb looked up from tying his shoe. "You coming to my game Saturday?" "If I can." "You said that last time." "I know what I said." Julia jumped in before the mood shifted further. "He's got quarter-end stuff happening." Caleb shrugged in that small, wounded way kids do when they're trying not to care too much. Emmanuel leaned down, kissed the top of Caleb's head, then grabbed his travel mug. Before leaving, he glanced toward Julia. "You transferred money for the HOA fee, right?" "I thought you were doing that." His forehead tightened instantly. "Julia, what?" "It was due yesterday. I can do it today." "You said you handled it." "No, I said I thought you were handling it." For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Emmanuel shook his head. "Forget it. I'll take care of it." The front door shut harder than necessary behind him. Silence settled through the kitchen after that. Caleb pushed his scrambled eggs around with a fork. "Are you guys mad at each other?" Julia forced her voice lighter than she felt. "No, baby. You always say that." That one landed harder than she expected. She turned back toward the sink so he wouldn't study her face too closely. Outside, Emmanuel's black SUV backed down the driveway and disappeared around the corner. The rest of the morning moved normally after that, at least from the outside. Laundry, school drop-off. A Target run where Julia stood in an aisle comparing cereal prices longer than she probably should have. By noon, she'd almost convinced herself the weird tension at breakfast didn't matter. Except later that evening, while they sat on opposite ends of the couch with the television running, she noticed Emmanuel smiling at his phone. Not a casual smile either. Different than that. Small, focused, private. Julia looked over automatically. The second he noticed, he tilted the screen away. Just slightly, but enough. Looking back later, Julia tried a few times to figure out exactly when things between her and Emmanuel started feeling off. Not bad all the time. That would have been easier, honestly. There were still normal moments back then. Inside jokes in the grocery store. Watching Caleb try to tell stories too fast at dinner. Falling asleep during movies they both pretended they were still watching. That was part of what confused her for so long. Nothing collapsed all at once. The distance showed up gradually, like background noise you stop noticing until the room goes quiet again. Emmanuel started working later more often, after his promotion downtown. At first, Julia believed him completely because the job sounded exhausting every time he talked about it. Conference calls, client pressure, budget meetings, people above him demanding impossible things. Sometimes he came home wired and restless, pacing the kitchen while reheating leftovers at 10:30 at night. Other times, he barely spoke. "You okay?" she asked him once while folding laundry on their bed. "Fine." "You don't seem fine." "I'm tired, Julia." That answer became common enough she eventually stopped asking follow-up questions. And honestly, she understood stress changing people for periods of time. They were adults, married 11 years. Life wasn't supposed to feel exciting every second. Still, there were little shifts she noticed even while trying not to make too much of them. New shirts, more gym time, a different cologne she didn't remember him buying. Then, the phone habit started. Screen face down, taking calls outside, smiling at messages while pretending not to. Even then, cheating wasn't the first place her mind went. That embarrassed her later, not because she trusted him, because she trusted the version of their life she thought they had. The Thursday she found out started completely ordinary. Caleb had soccer practice at 6. Julia spent most of the afternoon cleaning because Emmanuel's parents were supposed to visit that weekend, and his mother somehow always managed to inspect the house without looking obvious about it. By 5:30 she was rushing around trying to find Caleb's other shin guard while he yelled from upstairs that they were going to be late. "You said you packed them." "I packed one." "How do you pack one shin guard by accident?" "I don't know, Caleb, but apparently I'm talented." He came downstairs, hopping on one foot, trying to pull his cleat on. Julia grabbed her keys off the counter and noticed Emmanuel's laptop bag sitting beside the dining room table. That was unusual. He guarded that thing constantly. Her first thought was, honestly, annoyance. "Seriously?" she muttered. She pulled out her phone to call him, but it went straight to voicemail twice. "Mom, hurry." "I know." The laptop sat half-zipped. Julia opened it mostly out of reflex, planning to message him through his work email and tell him he forgot it. The screen lit immediately, and there they were. Messages already open. A woman named Rachel. At first, Julia barely reacted because she assumed it was work. Then she read the sentence sitting near the bottom of the screen. Last night felt different. Her eyes moved lower before her brain fully caught up. She suspects anything? The kitchen suddenly felt weirdly small. "Mom," Caleb shouted from the hallway. "Did you find the thing?" Julia kept staring. More messages. Inside jokes. Hotel reservations. A picture of Rachel holding a wine glass she definitely hadn't sent to a married coworker accidentally. Julia heard Caleb running toward the kitchen. She shut the laptop too fast. "You okay?" he asked. For one strange second, she forgot how to answer normal questions. "Yeah, you look weird." "I'm fine. We gotta go." He narrowed his eyes a little like kids do when they know adults are lying badly, but he grabbed his backpack anyway. The drive to soccer practice passed in fragments. Caleb talking about a kid on his team who kept picking his nose during drills. Traffic lights, the steering wheel slippery against her palms. At one point, Caleb asked for apple juice after practice, and Julia almost started crying right there at the red light because the request sounded so painfully normal compared to what was happening inside her head. That stayed with her afterward, more than almost anything else. The fact that life didn't pause for devastation. Children still needed snacks. Cars still needed gas. You still had to remember shin guards. At the soccer field, she sat through practice without seeing most of it. Parents chatted nearby in folding chairs. One dad complained about property taxes. Somebody's toddler kept eating dirt near the bleachers. A woman beside Julia asked where she bought Caleb's cleats. Julia answered automatically. Meanwhile, her brain kept replaying those messages over and over, like something inside her refused to fully absorb them. Last night felt different. She suspects anything. By the time they got home, she'd made one decision. She wasn't doing this in front of Caleb, so she moved through the evening carefully. Dinner, homework, bath, bedtime. Caleb noticed she was distracted. "You forgot the funny voices." "What?" "When you read." "Oh." She picked the book back up. "Sorry." Halfway through the story, she lost her place completely. Caleb watched her for a second from under his blanket. "Mom?" "Yeah? Are you sick?" "No, baby." "You sure?" Julia smoothed his hair back gently. "I'm sure." He accepted that because children usually want reassurance more than explanation. After he fell asleep, Julia sat alone at the kitchen table in the dark for nearly 20 minutes before Emmanuel finally came home. She heard the garage door first, then footsteps, then his keys hitting the counter. "Hey," he called casually. "You seen my—" He stopped when he saw the laptop sitting in the middle of the kitchen table. Julia looked up at him. Neither of them spoke for a second. Emmanuel loosened his tie slowly. "You opened it." Not angry, not panicked. That part unsettled her immediately. Julia folded her arms tightly across herself, because suddenly she felt cold. "How long?" He looked down at the counter. Julia. No, don't do that. How long? He exhaled heavily through his nose and pulled out a chair, almost like he knew this conversation had been coming eventually, and was disappointed it finally arrived. A few months. Julia stared at him. A few months? It wasn't supposed to. She laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. Wow. Can we not do this theatrically? That sentence changed something inside her. Not fully, not all at once, but enough. Because up until then, some part of Julia still expected guilt from him. Fear, maybe. Shame. Instead, he sounded tired, like this conversation was inconvenient. Who is she? Rachel. I got that far. She works with me. Julia nodded slowly. How old is she? What does that matter? How old? He rubbed his forehead. 26. Julia looked away for a second. 26. Recently divorced, he explained. Started at the company about a year earlier. They connected. He actually used that word once, and Julia almost asked him if he could hear himself talking. Instead, she sat there gripping the edge of the table, hard enough her fingers hurt. You brought her into our life. That's not fair. Not fair? Julia blinked at him. You were texting her while sitting beside me on the couch. We haven't been good for a while. There it is. What? The excuse. It's not an excuse. You cheated on me. And you think you've been happy here? Julia stared at him across the kitchen, because that was the moment she understood something she hadn't seen clearly before. Emmanuel needed her partially responsible for this, not because it was true, because if the marriage had simply failed on his side, then he had to become the kind of man who destroyed his family for a coworker. And apparently, he couldn't tolerate that version of himself. I was tired, Emmanuel, she said finally. I was raising our son and trying to hold this house together while you disappeared into work all the time. You disappeared too. No. I got overwhelmed. There's a difference. The room went still after that. Emmanuel looked away first. Julia suddenly realized she didn't recognize the man sitting across from her anymore. Not fully. The face was familiar. The voice was familiar. But the person underneath both of those things felt strangely unreachable. Now, later that night they slept on opposite sides of the bed, without touching. At some point around 2 a.m, Julia opened her eyes and saw the glow of Emmanuel's phone screen reflected faintly against the ceiling. He was turned away from her while typing. She stared at his back for a long time. Then she rolled over toward the wall and understood, with a kind of awful clarity, that whatever marriage she thought she still had probably ended long before she found the messages. The next few days felt strangely organized for something that was destroying her life. That bothered Julia almost as much as the affair itself. People still needed breakfast. Caleb still had school. Trash still had to go out Thursday morning because the HOA complained if cans stayed visible too long. Meanwhile, her marriage was sitting in the middle of the house, like broken glass nobody wanted to step on directly. Emmanuel acted careful around Caleb after the confrontation, almost overly patient. That made Julia angrier than if he'd yelled. He helped with homework, asked about soccer practice, made pancakes Saturday morning, like they were performing a version of family life neither of them believed anymore. At one point, Caleb laughed at something Emmanuel said, and Julia had to leave the kitchen because hearing normal happiness mixed into all of this made her chest hurt. They still slept in the same bed, though barely. There was a line between them now, neither crossed. Some nights Emmanuel stayed downstairs pretending to work on his laptop until after midnight. Other nights, Julia lay awake, listening to him shower at 1 a.m, wondering if he'd been with Rachel before coming home. She hated that thought most because it changed ordinary things into contaminated ones. His cologne, his shirts, the late meetings. Every memory suddenly needed rechecking. By Tuesday afternoon, Julia realized she'd started moving through the house carefully, like loud emotions might scare Caleb even more than silence already was. Kids always know something's wrong, long before adults admit it. Caleb watched them constantly now, not obvious staring, more like observation, his eyes moving back and forth during dinner whenever one of them spoke. You guys okay? He asked one evening, while Emmanuel loaded the dishwasher. We're fine, Emmanuel answered too quickly. Caleb looked at Julia instead. She forced a nod. Just grown-up stuff. What kind of stuff? Boring stuff. That means bad stuff. Neither of them answered. Caleb sighed dramatically and went upstairs with his plate. After he disappeared, Emmanuel closed the dishwasher harder than necessary. You don't have to look miserable every second. Julia turned slowly from the sink. I'm sorry my reaction to your affair isn't upbeat enough for you. You know what I mean. No, actually, I don't. Emmanuel leaned against the counter, rubbing both hands over his face. I'm saying maybe we stop acting like this came out of nowhere. There it was again, that same quiet reshaping of reality. Julia dried her hands carefully before speaking, because she suddenly understood these conversations mattered more than they looked like they did. Yes, we had problems. We were disconnected. Okay, you were unhappy too. Julia looked straight at him. I was exhausted. That's not different. It is to me. He shook his head immediately. You checked out years ago. I had a baby attached to me 24 hours a day while you stayed late at the office. That's unfair. No. Unfair is finding out from laptop messages your husband's sleeping with someone from work. Emmanuel's jaw tightened. You keep reducing this to one thing. Julia actually laughed at that. One thing? I'm trying to have an adult conversation. No, you're trying to spread the blame around enough that you don't have to feel guilty. For a second she thought he might argue harder. Instead, he went strangely calm. That's exactly what I mean, Julia. Every conversation turns into this. This happened because you cheated. It happened because this marriage stopped working. The sentence sat there between them, and the hardest part was, Julia couldn't fully deny pieces of it. The marriage had changed. They barely touched anymore. Conversations revolved around schedules, bills, Caleb, errands. Sometimes entire evenings passed with the television talking louder than either of them, but none of that erased choice. That distinction became important to her very quickly. Marriage problems were real. Loneliness was real. So was betrayal. And Emmanuel kept trying to flatten those things into the same category. Later that night, Julia stood in the laundry room pretending to fold towels while trying not to cry from pure frustration. Not dramatic heartbreak exactly, more like disorientation. Because she kept replaying years of her life, wondering which parts were real and which parts she'd edited into something safer to believe. The next morning, after dropping Caleb at school, she drove downtown to meet with a divorce attorney named Linda Mercer. Even scheduling the appointment had made her feel vaguely sick. Divorce belonged to other people in Julia's mind. Angry people. Loud people. Couples who threw dishes at walls. Not them. The law office sat on the 4th floor of an older brick building near Main Street. The waiting room smelled faintly like coffee and printer toner. Julia sat clutching her purse while a muted television played weather updates nobody watched. A couple across from her argued softly over paperwork. You told me you already filled this out. Well, maybe if you'd actually looked. The receptionist cut in smoothly before the fight escalated. Mrs. Carter? Julia stood too fast. Linda Mercer turned out to be in her 60s with silver blonde hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She spoke gently but fast, like someone used to emotionally overwhelmed people, needing information quickly. So, Linda said after they sat down, why don't you tell me where things stand right now? Julia opened her mouth, then unexpectedly started crying. Not loudly, just immediate tears she clearly hadn't planned on. Oh God, she muttered, embarrassed. Sorry. Linda slid a tissue box toward her without reacting much. It's all right. Happens every day. That weirdly helped. Julia wiped under her eyes and tried again. My husband's having an affair. Linda nodded once. How long have you been married? 11 years. Children? One son, Caleb. He's 8. And financially? Julia hesitated there. That was the first moment she realized she didn't fully know how to answer. Well, my husband handles most of it. Linda's expression stayed neutral. What does that mean exactly? He works in corporate finance. I stayed home more after our son was born. Julia shifted in her seat. I worked part-time some too. Bookkeeping mostly. Whose name are major assets under? Our names, I think. You think? Julia felt heat rise into her face. The house is both of us, I'm pretty sure. And investment accounts? Mostly his. But we're married, so. Her voice faded on its own. Linda folded her hands together carefully. Julia, I need you to understand something early so there are no surprises later. Marriage does create shared legal protections, but practical access to money and documented ownership matter too. Julia frowned. I don't understand. Linda reached for a yellow legal pad. Retirement accounts, brokerage accounts, bonuses, stock options. If most of those are structured primarily through your husband's employment and under his management, untangling access can become complicated. But I stayed home because we agreed that made more sense for our family. I understand. No, I mean together. Julia leaned forward now. It wasn't like I quit working against his wishes. Linda nodded sympathetically. I know. Courts do recognize non-financial contribution. Raising children matters. Supporting a household matters. Then why does this sound bad? Linda paused. Because lawyers who've done this long enough know when honesty is going to hurt somebody. It sounds vulnerable, she said finally. Julia sat very still after that. Vulnerable. Not protected. Not secure. Vulnerable. Suddenly dozens of old conversations replayed differently in her head. It's easier this way. I'll handle it. You don't need to stress over financial stuff. At the time, those sentences sounded responsible. Sitting in that office now, they sounded like distance. Linda started discussing practical next steps after that. Documentation, bank statements, custody considerations, temporary arrangements. Julia listened, but parts of her brain kept snagging on one ugly realization. She had trusted marriage itself more than actual paperwork. Trusted shared history, shared parenting, shared life. Meanwhile, Emmanuel had apparently kept building financial structure around himself the entire time. By the end of the meeting, Julia's head hurt. Linda handed her a folder before she left. Do not panic yet, she said firmly. People rebuild from this, all the time. Julia nodded weakly. Outside, downtown Louisville moved around her normally. People carried coffees. A delivery truck blocked half the street. Some guy in a suit laughed into his Bluetooth headset, walking past her. Julia stood there beside the parking meter, feeling like she'd stepped out of her own life for an hour and returned to find everything slightly rearranged. That night, after Caleb went to bed, she found Emmanuel sitting at the kitchen island scrolling through stock reports on his tablet. We need to talk about divorce, she said. He looked up immediately, not surprised, almost relieved she'd finally said it out loud. Okay. The calmness in his voice scared her more than anger would have. The mediation office sat in a low brick building 20 minutes from downtown Louisville beside a dentist and a state farm agency. Julia remembered that stupid detail because she stared at the insurance sign for almost 5 full minutes before going inside. Rain tapped steadily against the windshield while she sat parked with the engine running. Her hands hurt from gripping the steering wheel too long. She hadn't slept much the night before. Caleb woke up around midnight after a nightmare and climbed into bed beside her, knees and elbows everywhere like he used to when he was smaller. Dad moving out forever? He'd asked sleepily. Julia stared at the ceiling before answering, I don't know yet, which technically wasn't a lie at the time, though deep down, she already knew. Inside the mediation office, everything smelled faintly burnt. Burnt coffee, burnt microwave popcorn maybe. The kind of office smell that settles into carpet after years of stressed people sitting in small rooms trying not to explode at each other. A receptionist handed Julia paperwork she'd already filled out once before. Sorry, the woman said. We need updated signatures. Julia nodded, without reading most of it. Through the hallway glass, she spotted Emmanuel already seated inside the conference room with his attorney. Navy suit, white shirt, calm posture. He looked exactly like himself. That annoyed her immediately, not because she wanted him miserable exactly, because she was falling apart in private, while he still looked prepared for quarterly earnings calls. His attorney stood to shake Julia's hand politely when she entered. Morning. Hi. Emmanuel glanced up briefly. You're late. Julia checked the clock on the wall automatically. She wasn't late. Her jaw tightened. No, I'm not. The mediator entered before anything else could start. Mid-50s maybe. Tired eyes. The expression of a woman who'd watched hundreds of marriages dissolve across beige conference tables. All right, she said, while sitting down. Let's continue discussing custody structure and financial agreements. Custody structure. Like Caleb was an office renovation. Julia folded her hands together under the table because she could already feel anger trying to crawl up her throat. For the first 20 minutes, everything stayed technical. School schedules, holiday rotation, transportation responsibilities. Emmanuel spoke in that measured professional voice he used during work calls. I think consistency matters most for Caleb right now. Julia almost laughed hearing him say that while sleeping with a coworker for months behind everyone's back. Instead, she stayed quiet. Linda had warned her before mediation started. Do not react emotionally to every provocation. Some people use calmness strategically. At first, Emmanuel sounded reasonable enough that Julia briefly wondered if maybe they could survive this process without destroying each other completely. Then finances entered the conversation. His attorney slid several pages across the table. Based on Mr. Carter's income and current asset obligations, we believe this proposal offers substantial support. Julia scanned numbers without fully absorbing them. Temporary assistance, housing support, structured payments. Then she noticed the custody section attached to it. Primary residential custody, Father. Her eyes stopped moving. What is this? Emmanuel answered before his attorney could. It's practical. Julia looked up slowly. Practical. You don't currently have stable full-time income. I've been raising our child, and you'll still see him. The mediator immediately jumped in. Let's slow down a little. No, Julia said, without taking her eyes off Emmanuel. I want him to explain this. Emmanuel leaned back in his chair. I'm trying to avoid dragging Caleb through a long legal fight. You're trying to take him. That's not what this says. Julia pushed the papers slightly across the table. It literally says primary custody. You'd have shared parenting time. Her chest started tightening now, because his tone stayed so calm, like this was obvious, logical, efficient. The mediator cleared her throat carefully. Mr. Carter, perhaps you can explain your reasoning more specifically. Emmanuel nodded once. Julia hasn't worked consistently in years. I'm financially capable of providing stability immediately. Same school district, same extracurriculars, same neighborhood. And his mother? Julia asked. No one's removing you from his life. That sentence almost made her lose her temper. Like motherhood was visitation. She stared at him across the table, trying to understand whether he actually believed what he was saying, or whether he'd simply rehearsed it enough to sound convincing. Then he said the part she never forgot. If Caleb primarily lives with me, I'll make sure Julia has enough support to reset comfortably. The room changed after that. Even his attorney shifted slightly in his chair. Julia blinked once. And if he doesn't? Emmanuel hesitated for half a second. Small pause, barely visible. Then, we'll both have to make adjustments. There it was. Not direct enough to sound monstrous, which almost made it worse. Julia leaned back slowly in her chair. You're asking me to trade custody for financial stability. That's not what I said. No? Her voice came out flatter now. Then say it differently. Julia, say it differently. His jaw tightened. I'm saying we should be realistic about what each of us can provide right now. The mediator jumped in again. Perhaps we should take a short break. But Julia barely heard her, because suddenly, dozens of small moments from their marriage rearranged themselves in her head again. The account structures, the investments, the way Emmanuel always needed control over financial decisions. He'd been building leverage for years without ever calling it that, and sitting there now, he genuinely believed leverage would win. You think I'll give up eventually? Julia said. Emmanuel frowned immediately. This isn't about winning. Yes, it is. You're emotional right now. His attorney closed his eyes briefly after that sentence, like he already knew it landed badly. Julia stared at Emmanuel for a long second. Then she spoke carefully because anger suddenly felt less useful than clarity. You think if things get hard enough financially, I'll fold. No one said that. You didn't have to. Rain hit the windows harder outside. The mediator suggested another break, and this time nobody argued. Julia walked into the hallway feeling unsteady. Linda followed a few seconds later, carrying a legal pad against her chest. You okay? Julia laughed once under her breath. Honestly, no. Linda lowered her voice. What he's proposing isn't unusual in high-income custody negotiations. That doesn't make it less disgusting. No, it doesn't. Julia rubbed both hands over her face. I stayed home because we agreed I should. I know. And now suddenly I'm unqualified to raise my own kid because I trusted my husband? Linda waited before answering. People with financial advantage often convince themselves they're being rational. Julia looked down the hallway toward the conference room door. He thinks I'll break. Linda didn't respond directly to that, which felt like an answer itself. Back inside, mediation continued another 2 hours. Schedules, asset division, temporary support numbers. Julia barely remembered parts of it afterward because one realization kept circling through her head over and over. Emmanuel wasn't trying to destroy her emotionally. He was trying to outlast her. There was a difference. He believed exhaustion would eventually make her cooperative. Bills, rent, work, single parenting. At some point, he thought survival pressure would force compromise. And maybe that strategy would have worked on somebody else. Or maybe it almost worked on her too. By the time mediation finally ended, the rain outside had turned the parking lot gray and shiny beneath the streetlights. Emmanuel caught up with her near the entrance doors while she searched her purse for keys. Julia, she kept looking down. What? I know you're upset. That almost made her smile from disbelief. Upset, like somebody forgot her birthday dinner reservation. You blew up our family. It's more complicated than that. No, it actually isn't. He lowered his voice. You're acting like I'm your enemy. She finally looked at him then. And what scared her most was how sincerely confused he seemed, as though everything happening now was unfortunate but manageable if she'd stop making it difficult. You stood in there and tried to use money against me. I'm trying to make sure Caleb has stability. You mean your version of stability? Emmanuel exhaled sharply. You can barely support yourself right now. The words hung there between them. Cold, precise, intentional. Julia felt them land physically. Not because she thought he was completely wrong, because part of her feared he wasn't. That was the cruelest part of financial dependence. Even when someone weaponized it against you, pieces of it still sounded true. She stared at him another second before stepping outside into the rain. Her car sat near the back of the lot under a flickering light. By the time she got inside, her clothes were damp around the shoulders. Julia locked the doors immediately, even though Emmanuel wasn't following her. Then she sat there breathing hard with both hands pressed against the steering wheel. Through the windshield she could see him still standing beneath the awning, talking to his attorney calmly, like the conversation had already moved on in his mind. For the first time since the affair started, Julia understood something clearly enough that it stopped frightening her. Emmanuel mistook motherhood for weakness, and eventually that was going to be his biggest mistake. The apartment sat above a tire shop off Preston Highway, beside a pawn store and a laundromat with broken neon lighting that blinked all night. When Julia first unlocked the door, Caleb stood in the middle of the living room, turning slowly in a circle. That smell weird. Julia tried not to react. The place carried a permanent mix of old carpet, grease drifting up from the garage below, and whatever cleaning product the landlord used to cover both. It's temporary, she said. Caleb nodded, like he believed her. At the time, she wanted to believe it too. The apartment had 2 bedrooms if you were generous with the definition of bedroom. The second one barely fit Caleb's twin bed and a narrow dresser Denise found at a thrift store for $40. The air conditioner rattled hard enough to wake them some nights. Water pressure disappeared anytime somebody downstairs used the industrial sink. And every afternoon around 4:30, the tire shop compressor kicked on beneath the floorboards with a loud vibrating hum that made the kitchen glasses shake faintly inside the cabinets. Still, it was theirs. No tension sitting at the dinner table waiting to explode. No checking Emmanuel's mood before speaking. No wondering whether he'd come home late smelling like another woman's perfume. The first night there, Julia sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by half-unpacked boxes while Caleb built a blanket fort in the corner using dining chairs and duct tape. You think Dad's house is bigger than this? He asked casually. Julia kept unpacking silverware. Yes. You think Rachel lives there now? The question caught her off guard, mostly because of how normal Caleb sounded, asking it. Children adjusted to impossible information in pieces. I don't know, she answered carefully. Caleb crawled halfway into the blanket fort. She wears too much perfume. Julia almost smiled despite everything. Probably not something you need to tell her directly. I wasn't planning to. That first month passed in survival mode. Julia got a morning job at a medical office answering phones and handling patient intake forms. The pay wasn't great, but the hours worked around Caleb's school schedule, 3 evenings a week she cleaned a downtown law office after hours for extra money. Denise watched Caleb those nights. "You owe me exactly 1 kidney and maybe some mozzarella sticks," Denise told her, while stealing fries from Julia's plate at a diner one Tuesday. Julia snorted tiredly. "I can probably afford 1 mozzarella stick." Denise had been her cousin technically, but growing up they were more like sisters who fought constantly until adulthood made them appreciate each other better. She never treated Julia like a charity case either. That mattered. When Julia tried apologizing too much for needing help, Denise cut her off immediately. "You stayed home raising a kid for years while your husband played corporate king. Stop acting embarrassed because life blew up." Easy for Denise to say maybe, but shame still followed Julia around in strange ways. At the grocery store, counting coupons. At school pickup, driving an older car after Emmanuel kept the SUV. When parents from their old neighborhood smiled too carefully and asked, "So, how are things?" People loved divorce gossip as long as they could pretend concern while collecting details. By October, Julia's feet hurt almost constantly. The medical office required standing most of the morning, and the law office downtown had marble floors that punished your knees after 3 hours with a mop bucket. Some nights she came home so exhausted she sat on the closed toilet lid in the bathroom, staring at nothing, before forcing herself to shower. Once, after Caleb fell asleep, she cried because she'd miscalculated the checking account by $32 and didn't know whether gas or groceries mattered more until payday. That kind of crying surprised her. No dramatic breakdown, no sobbing. She covered her mouth with one hand so Caleb wouldn't hear through the wall and waited for it to pass. The worst part wasn't even being tired. It was feeling reduced, like her entire life had narrowed into bills, schedules, and trying not to panic publicly. Meanwhile, Emmanuel appeared to be having the time of his life, at least online. Boat pictures on Lake Cumberland, steakhouses downtown, Rachel smiling beside him, holding wine glasses under restaurant lighting. One Saturday morning, Julia made the mistake of opening Facebook before coffee. A mutual acquaintance had tagged Emmanuel and Rachel at some rooftop event. Rachel wore a white dress with one shoulder exposed. Emmanuel stood beside her, grinning in a way Julia hadn't seen in years. The caption read, "Sometimes life gets better when you stop settling." Julia stared at the screen until her vision blurred. Then she locked her phone and shoved it across the counter hard enough that Caleb looked up from his cereal. "You okay?" "Fine." "You don't sound fine." "I'm tired." That answer came too quickly now. She noticed it immediately, because Emmanuel used to say the exact same thing whenever she tried reaching him emotionally near the end of the marriage. The realization irritated her enough. She stood up and started washing dishes that were already clean. A week later, Denise called while Julia folded laundry. "You need to stop looking at his social media." "I'm not." "Julia, okay, sometimes. You know none of that stuff is real, right?" Julia matched socks aggressively. "I know." But knowing didn't stop it from hurting, because public happiness felt like proof she'd become replaceable faster than she understood how to process. Around the same time, Caleb started saying things that left bruises Julia couldn't visibly react to. Small comments at first. "Dad says you were always angry." Or, "Dad says grown-ups fall out of love sometimes." Julia answered carefully, every single time. "Adults see things differently. Your dad and I both love you. We're figuring things out." She refused to make Caleb choose sides emotionally, even when Emmanuel clearly wasn't offering the same restraint. Then one Thursday evening, while driving home from Denise's apartment after work, Caleb spoke from the back seat. "Dad said you left him first." Julia tightened her grip on the wheel. Streetlights blurred softly through the windshield as rain started again outside. "What do you mean?" "He said you checked out before Rachel happened." The sentence sounded rehearsed. Not in a manipulative way from Caleb, more like he was trying to repeat adult language he didn't fully understand. Julia stared ahead at the red light changing slowly. "What did you say?" Caleb shrugged behind her. "I don't know." The light turned green. Cars moved around them. Julia could feel anger rising fast now, hot and immediate, but Caleb wasn't the person she was angry at. That distinction mattered. "He shouldn't talk to you about grown-up relationship stuff," she said finally. "But is it true?" Julia opened her mouth, closed it again, because this was the impossible part. Telling enough truth without handing your child emotional damage they'd carry into adulthood. "We had problems before the divorce," she said carefully. "That's true." So, you both messed up? The question sat there for a second. Then Julia answered honestly, no. Not the same way. Caleb looked down at his sneakers after that, and Julia suddenly realized something terrifying. Emmanuel wasn't only trying to preserve his image anymore. He was slowly editing reality inside their son's head. After that conversation in the car, Julia started noticing changes in Caleb she couldn't unsee anymore. Small things. He asked more questions before going to Emmanuel's house now. Rachel gonna be there? Or Dad working late again? Sometimes he packed and unpacked the same backpack 3 times before weekends with Emmanuel, like he was worried about forgetting something important and getting blamed for it. One Sunday night, after coming back from Emmanuel's place, Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway while Julia cooked spaghetti. Can divorced people get married again? Julia glanced over her shoulder. Yeah, to anybody. I mean, usually, that's the idea. Caleb thought about that. Then, if Dad marries Rachel, do I gotta call her my stepmom? Julia stirred the sauce slowly. You don't have to call anybody anything you're uncomfortable with. He nodded, but his face stayed tense. At 8 years old, Caleb still believed there was a correct answer adults were hiding from him somewhere. Like if he asked enough questions, eventually someone would explain divorce in a way that actually made sense. But adults barely understood it themselves half the time. That same week, Julia noticed Caleb chewing the sleeves of his hoodies again. He used to do that in kindergarten whenever he got anxious before school presentations. Now the cuff stayed damp almost constantly. You nervous about something? She asked one night while folding laundry. No. You sure? Shrug. Kids could carry stress in their bodies long before they learned how to describe it properly. By November, exchanges with Emmanuel had become stiff and painfully polite. They met in parking lots mostly, school pickup lanes, grocery store entrances, once outside a Walgreens while freezing rain coated the sidewalks. His teacher says he's distracted lately, Julia told Emmanuel while Caleb climbed into the SUV. He's adjusting. He's anxious. He's fine. Julia looked at him sharply. You don't know that. Emmanuel shut the driver's side door harder than necessary. You make everything heavier than it needs to be. Then he drove away before she could answer. Later that night, Caleb called her from Emmanuel's house, asking where his blue blanket was. You left it here, baby. Oh, you okay? Yeah, but his voice sounded strange, muted somehow. You sure? A pause. Then, Dad and Rachel were fighting earlier. Julia stopped folding towels. What happened? I don't know. In the background, she heard television noise, too loud for the room. Was anybody hurt? No. Another pause. Then Caleb lowered his voice instinctively. Dad threw something. Julia sat down slowly on the edge of the couch. What did he throw? I think a glass. Her stomach tightened immediately. Where are you right now? My room. Okay. Listen to me. She kept her voice steady, even though her heartbeat was climbing fast. If you ever feel scared over there, you call me right away. I don't care what time it is. Okay. And if Dad asks, you were calling about your blanket. All right? Okay. She barely slept that night. Every bad possibility kept replaying itself in loops through her head. At 7 the next morning, Emmanuel texted, Everything fine. Caleb overheard an argument. Don't make this dramatic. Julia stared at the message while standing in the medical office break room holding terrible coffee. Don't make this dramatic. That sentence followed her all day, like fear itself was inconvenient to him. A few days later, Caleb admitted more details while they sat in traffic after school pickup. Rachel was crying. Julia kept her eyes forward. Did they say what they were fighting about? No. He picked at the corner of his backpack zipper. Dad grabbed her arm, though. Julia's hands tightened on the steering wheel. What do you mean, grabbed? Like, hard. Caleb demonstrated awkwardly against his own wrist. She told him to let go. Traffic crawled another few feet. You saw this yourself? Yeah. Did he hurt you? No. Julia nodded once, though her chest had gone cold. That conversation changed the way she thought about Emmanuel. After that, not instantly, but enough, because affairs were one thing, lying was one thing. But the image of Caleb standing in a hallway listening to adults scream while Emmanuel grabbed Rachel hard enough to scare a child stayed lodged in Julia's mind permanently. Around the same time, weird mail started showing up at the apartment. At first, she assumed it was leftover financial paperwork from the divorce process. Tax notices, bank envelopes, business forms. Most went straight into a pile near the microwave because she barely had energy left. Business forms. Most went straight into a pile near the microwave because she barely had energy left by evening to read complicated legal language. Then one Saturday morning she opened an envelope while Caleb watched cartoons in the living room. The letterhead read, Crescent Harbor Consulting LLC. Julia frowned immediately. She'd never heard of it before. The document listed both her and Emmanuel connected to the company. Mom? Caleb called. You making pancakes or no? 1 second. She kept reading. There were account summaries attached too. Large transfers moving between business entities she didn't recognize. Her name appeared several times throughout the packet. Julia felt irritation first, more than fear. Probably leftover tax structuring or something Emmanuel handled during the marriage without explaining properly. Still, she grabbed her phone. Emmanuel answered on the 4th ring, sounding distracted. What? What is Crescent Harbor Consulting? Silence, briefly. Then, where'd you hear that? I got paperwork. It's old business stuff. What business stuff? You wouldn't understand the filings. Julia stared at the papers. My name's on this. So what does that mean? It means your name's on paperwork, Julia. She could already feel him trying to end the conversation. No, stop. I'm serious. Why am I attached to some LLC I've never heard of? Emmanuel exhaled impatiently. Because sometimes married couples get listed jointly for tax purposes. What tax purposes? You're overthinking this. Then explain it. I don't have time for this right now. The line went dead. Julia lowered the phone slowly. In the living room, Caleb laughed at something on television. Normal Saturday afternoon sounds, cartoons, traffic outside, the upstairs neighbor running a vacuum. Meanwhile, a strange cold feeling started spreading through Julia's stomach. Not panic exactly, more instinct than anything. Like her brain recognized danger before the rest of her caught up. Over the next 2 weeks, more envelopes arrived. Unknown account statements, tax forms tied to addresses she didn't recognize, business correspondence listing her as co-owner or officer on companies she'd never discussed with Emmanuel once during their marriage. She spread everything across the kitchen table one night after Caleb fell asleep. The paperwork looked dense and confusing under the apartment light. Numbers, transfers, entity names. Some signatures looked like hers, or close enough to make her pulse jump. Julia picked up one document again and stared harder. Had she signed this? Maybe buried inside mortgage paperwork years ago. Some refinance packet? Tax season documents Emmanuel rushed her through while she cooked dinner and helped Caleb with homework. She honestly couldn't tell anymore, and that frightened her more than she wanted to admit, because for the first time since the divorce started, Julia realized there might be things happening around her marriage she never understood at all. Julia waited almost 6 days before driving to Lexington. Part of that was scheduling. Most of it was denial. The envelopes stayed stacked near the microwave while she moved around them, pretending life already contained enough problems without inventing new ones. But every time she walked past the paperwork, her stomach tightened. By Friday morning, she finally called Harold Bennett. He answered on the 3rd ring. Well, he said in that slow, gravelly voice she remembered from childhood. Haven't heard from you in a while. Julia sat in her car outside the medical office, gripping her phone. I need help understanding something. Harold paused briefly. That serious, huh? I think maybe. All right, come by tomorrow. Harold had been friends with Julia's father for most of her life. They'd worked together years ago, before Harold moved into financial investigations for a regional firm that handled fraud cases and corporate audits. As a kid, Julia remembered him always smelling faintly like coffee and old paper. Big gray beard, reading glasses hanging low on his nose. The type of man who spoke carefully enough that people usually stopped interrupting him. He semi-retired after his 2nd heart attack, though according to her father before he passed away, Harold never fully stopped working because he didn't know how. The drive to Lexington took a little over an hour and a half. Rain threatened all morning. Without fully arriving, Caleb stayed with Denise for the afternoon, which made Julia feel guilty even though Denise practically shoved her out the door. You look like you're gonna throw up, Denise told her while opening the apartment door. Go figure your weird paperwork out. Thanks. Very comforting. You know what I mean. Harold lived outside the city near Georgetown, in a modest brick house with a deep front porch and wind chimes that clinked softly whenever the breeze picked up. He opened the door before Julia even knocked fully. "Hey, kid." Nobody else still called her kid anymore. That almost made her emotional immediately. Harold stepped aside. "Coffee, please." His kitchen looked exactly the same as she remembered from years earlier. Heavy wooden table, stacks of newspapers, University of Kentucky mug collection lining the cabinet above the sink. Julia spread the documents across the table, while Harold poured coffee into mismatched mugs. He didn't say much at first. That silence made her nervous faster than if he'd reacted dramatically. Harold adjusted his glasses and started reading line by line with the patience of somebody used to spotting mistakes buried in boring paperwork. Every few minutes he asked short questions. "You signed this knowingly?" "I don't remember." "What about this LLC? Never heard of it before last month." "You ever attend business meetings with your husband?" Julia almost laughed. "No." Harold grunted softly and kept reading. The kitchen clock ticked loud enough to become annoying after a while. Outside, a truck rolled slowly past the house. Julia wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, even though she'd barely touched it. Finally, Harold leaned back in his chair. "Well," he muttered. That one word dropped heavily into the room. Julia sat straighter. "What?" Harold removed his glasses slowly. "Some of these accounts look layered." "I don't know what that means." "It means money's moving through multiple entities before ending up somewhere else." Julia frowned. "For taxes?" "Maybe." That answer came too carefully. Harold slid one document closer. "See this company here?" "Yeah. It doesn't appear to have actual employees. So companies with no operational footprint, moving large sums of money, tend to attract attention eventually." Julia stared at the paper. None of it looked criminal to her, just confusing. Numbers, transfers, legal language. Harold tapped another page. "And your name appears connected to several of these filings." A cold feeling spread through her arms. "I didn't do any of this." "I know. But legally." "I said, I know." He rubbed his beard thoughtfully while reading again. "What exactly did your husband do in finance?" "Corporate logistics budgeting." "I think." "You think?" Julia shut her eyes briefly. That answer embarrassed her now, because the truth was, Emmanuel handled so much of their financial life that entire sections of it became background noise to her over the years. Retirement talk, tax structuring, business partnerships. He always explained things fast and confidently enough that asking follow-up questions made her feel stupid. Harold looked at her carefully. "You trusted him." Julia laughed once under her breath. "Apparently, no," Harold corrected gently. "Apparently, you were married." That landed harder than she expected. He gathered several papers into one stack. "Did you sign tax documents without reviewing them closely sometimes?" "Yes." "How often?" "I don't know. A lot, probably." "You ever give him access to your personal information? Social, digital signatures, login credentials?" Julia stared at him. "We were married." Harold nodded slowly. "Right." The room felt warmer suddenly. Or maybe Julia was panicking. She pushed hair behind one ear with shaky fingers. "Harold, am I in trouble?" He didn't answer immediately, which terrified her more than almost anything he could have said. Finally, "I don't know yet." Julia looked down at the paperwork spread across the table. A few months ago, she thought the worst thing Emmanuel could do was cheat on her. Now she sat in a kitchen, realizing she might be tied to financial activity she didn't even understand well enough to explain. Harold pointed toward a transfer summary. "These accounts move money through shell entities." Shell entities. Companies that exist mostly on paper. Why? To hide movement. Obscure origin points. Shift liability around. Julia felt her heartbeat climbing again. "But why would my name be attached?" Harold's expression tightened slightly. "Because spouses attract less scrutiny." She stared at him. The kitchen suddenly sounded too loud. Clock ticking, refrigerator humming, wind chimes outside. "You think he used me?" Harold held her gaze for a second. "I think your husband may have treated shared identity as insulation." Julia pressed both palms flat against the table because she honestly thought she might throw up. For several minutes, Neither of them spoke much after that. Harold continued sorting documents into smaller piles, while Julia tried piecing together years of ordinary marriage memories against this completely different possibility. Emmanuel rushing papers toward her while she cooked dinner. Sign here real quick. Need this before the bank closes. Tax deadline's tomorrow. At the time, those moments felt boring. Now they looked dangerous. Harold eventually stood and refilled both coffee mugs. You need copies of everything, he said. Digital and physical. Julia nodded automatically. And stop throwing mail away. I wasn't. You were thinking about it. She looked guilty immediately. Yeah, I figured. Harold sat back down. You told any attorneys about this yet? Not specifically. Do that carefully. What does that mean? It means you don't walk into a room accusing people of fraud without understanding what you're holding. Julia rubbed at the side of her forehead. I can't do federal prison, Harold. That finally made him look directly at her again. Hey, her eyes lifted. You listen to me. Panicking won't help you. But if my name's on all this, then we sort through it properly. Julia looked down again. A strange numbness had started replacing the panic now. Not calm exactly, more like overload. The drive home blurred together afterward. She missed her exit near Louisville because she kept replaying Harold's words over and over. Shared identity as insulation. Rain finally started halfway home. By the time she pulled into the apartment parking lot, her shoulders ached from tension. The tire shop downstairs was already closed for the evening. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly through the garage windows. Inside the apartment, Caleb sat cross-legged on the couch eating microwave popcorn while watching cartoons with Denise. Mom, he said immediately. Denise burned half the popcorn. I did not, Denise argued. The bag betrayed me. Julia managed a tired smile. You okay? Denise asked quietly, while Caleb turned back toward the television. Julia nodded too fast. Yeah. Denise studied her face for another second, but let it go. After she left, and Caleb finally went to sleep, Julia sat on the apartment floor, surrounded by paperwork again. The air conditioner rattled overhead. Cars hissed through rain outside. She picked up one form after another, trying to recognize pieces of her own life inside them. Signatures, account numbers, business names, and sitting there on the carpet sometime after midnight, Julia realized Emmanuel hadn't only betrayed her emotionally. He may have been building protection around himself using her name for years. After Lexington, Julia stopped treating the paperwork like an annoying side problem. It became part of her routine. Morning job, pick up Caleb, dinner, laundry, documents. Most nights after Caleb went to sleep, she sat at the small kitchen table with her laptop open and stacks of papers spread around her like she was cramming for an exam she never agreed to take. At first, she barely understood what she was looking for. Harold helped with that. Patterns matter more than single transactions, he told her during a phone call one Tuesday evening. Anybody can explain one weird transfer. Repetition's harder. So Julia started organizing everything by dates, tax forms, archived emails, account summaries, business filings. She found old folders buried in shared cloud storage Emmanuel forgot she still had partial access to. Password-protected PDFs, scanned signatures, expense reports from companies she'd never discussed with him once during their marriage. Some nights she got nowhere. Other nights, her stomach dropped every 20 minutes. One file showed reimbursement payments routed through 3 separate companies before ending in an account tied to Emmanuel's consulting work. Another listed Julia herself as a registered officer for an LLC she'd never heard spoken aloud before opening those envelopes. Harold reviewed copies carefully whenever she sent them. Your ex thinks he's smarter than everybody, he muttered during another call. Is he? Harold snorted. Men who think consequences don't apply to them usually get sloppy eventually. The strange thing was, the deeper Julia looked, the calmer she became outwardly. Not because she felt safe, because fear was getting replaced by focus. Survival alone didn't feel sufficient anymore. Now she needed understanding. Meanwhile, Emmanuel seemed increasingly irritated by her questions. Every conversation carried this underlying edge, like he could sense control shifting slightly out of his hands. One evening during custody exchange outside Caleb's school, he stopped Julia beside the parking lot. You've been talking to people. Julia adjusted Caleb's backpack strap. I talk to lots of people. You know what I mean. Cold wind pushed leaves across the pavement around them. Parents moved nearby, loading kids into minivans and SUVs without paying attention. Emmanuel lowered his voice. If you're trying to create problems financially, you're gonna regret it. Julia looked at him carefully. 3 months earlier, that sentence probably would have intimidated her immediately. Now it mostly sharpened something inside her. What financial problems? His jaw flexed once. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Before she could answer, Caleb came jogging back from the school entrance, carrying a forgotten folder. Oops. Emmanuel stepped back instantly, expression changing so fast it almost looked practiced. There's my guy. He smiled at Caleb and ruffled his hair. Julia watched the switch happen in real time. That unsettled her more than outright anger sometimes. A week later, Rachel approached her unexpectedly during pickup. Julia spotted her near the sidewalk before Rachel fully committed to walking over. Camel-colored coat, hair pulled back loosely, oversized sunglasses despite cloudy weather. For a second, Julia honestly considered getting back into her car and leaving, but Rachel already lifted a hand awkwardly. Hey, Julia crossed her arms automatically. Rachel stopped a few feet away. I know this is probably the last thing you want. You're right. Rachel nodded, like she expected that. Up close, she looked exhausted. Not glamorous, like the social media pictures anymore. There were dark half-circles under her makeup, and tension sitting visibly around her mouth. Neither woman spoke for a second. Children yelled nearby from the playground, while teachers directed traffic near the buses. Finally, Rachel said, "Can I ask you something?" Julia almost laughed from disbelief. That depends. Rachel looked down briefly. Was he always this controlling? The question caught Julia off guard hard enough that she answered honestly before thinking, "What do you mean?" Rachel gave a short, uncomfortable shrug. He checks my phone sometimes. Julia said nothing. And if I don't answer fast enough when he calls. Rachel hesitated. He gets weird about it. A cold understanding moved through Julia slowly. Not shock, recognition. Rachel rubbed her thumb against the strap of her purse. I know you probably hate me. Julia considered lying politely. Instead, I did. Rachel nodded once, like she'd earned that. But Julia glanced toward the school entrance, where Caleb still hadn't come outside yet. But I think maybe you didn't know who you were dealing with either. Rachel laughed softly, though there wasn't much humor in it. No, I definitely didn't. For the first time since the affair started, Julia saw Rachel less as the woman who helped destroy her marriage and more as somebody younger who stepped into a situation she badly misunderstood. That didn't erase what happened. It complicated it. Rachel looked like she wanted to say more, then changed her mind. He talks about you constantly, she admitted finally. Julia frowned. What does that mean? Everything's somehow your fault lately. That sounded familiar enough to almost be funny. Rachel lowered her voice. He gets angry if I question anything financial too. Julia's attention sharpened immediately. What kind of financial stuff? Rachel looked nervous now. I don't know specifics. I stopped asking. The school doors opened behind them. Kids started pouring outside. Rachel stepped backward immediately. I should go. Rachel, she paused. If somebody contacts you about business accounts or filings. Julia chose her words carefully. Don't assume he's protecting you. Rachel's face changed slightly after that. Not dramatic fear. More like a person realizing something they already suspected might actually be true. Then she walked away toward a silver sedan parked near the curb. Caleb finally appeared, carrying a crumpled spelling test. I got an 84. Julia blinked once, pulling herself back into the moment. That's good. No, it's not. It's spelling, not brain surgery. He slid into the passenger seat. As Julia drove away, she noticed Rachel sitting in her car, gripping the steering wheel without moving. That image stayed with her longer than expected, because anger had been easier, cleaner. Now everything felt messier than that. Over the next month, Julia's nightly document sessions became more methodical. She bought color-coded folders from Walmart and started labeling timelines, transfers, corporate reimbursements, account creation dates, tax discrepancies. Harold occasionally drove up from Lexington to review things in person. One evening, he sat at the apartment kitchen table, reading through printed emails while Caleb played video games in the bedroom. Harold tapped one page with his finger. There. Julia leaned closer. What? See the dates? She frowned. This transfer happens. Same week, your husband authorized a vendor payment through his company. So the vendor appears fake. Julia stared harder. How can you tell? No operating footprint, no tax history, same mailing address as another dissolved entity. Julia rubbed both hands over her face. How did I live with somebody doing this without noticing? Harold answered immediately. Because most people don't expect their spouse to be laundering money through shell companies. Julia let out one exhausted laugh. When you say it out loud, it sounds insane. Usually does. He stacked the papers neatly again. You need to understand something important, though. What? If this gets investigated formally, your husband's gonna panic. Julia looked up. What does that mean for me? Harold's expression hardened slightly. It means people protecting themselves financially don't always behave predictably once consequences show up. That warning followed her for days afterward. And maybe because of that, Julia started noticing how strained Emmanuel looked lately. Not publicly. Online, he still posted expensive dinners and smiling pictures with Rachel. But in person, different story. More irritable, more distracted, eyes tired. During one custody exchange, his phone rang 3 separate times in under 5 minutes. Each time he silenced it faster. What's going on? Julia asked before she could stop herself. Emmanuel looked at her sharply. Nothing. Then immediately, you been inside any of my accounts? The question came too fast, too defensive. Julia held his gaze. No. He studied her another second before nodding once. But when he drove away afterward, Julia noticed his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly enough to whiten his knuckles. And for the first time since all of this started, she got the feeling Emmanuel wasn't managing everything as easily as he wanted people to believe. By early spring, Julia's entire life felt organized around paperwork and waiting for hearings, waiting for financial disclosures, waiting for phone calls from lawyers that always seemed to arrive while she was standing in the grocery store, staring at yogurt prices. The custody hearing got pushed twice, once because of scheduling conflicts, once because Emmanuel's legal team requested additional financial review after new concerns surfaced regarding marital assets. That phrase irritated Julia immediately. New concerns, as if she accidentally wandered into suspicious financial activity instead of being buried inside it without her knowledge for years. The medical office stayed busy through allergy season, which meant Julia spent most mornings answering phones while secretly checking emails between patients. By lunchtime, her stomach usually hurt from too much coffee and not enough food. Then evenings became documents again. Harold at the kitchen table, Linda reviewing custody, prep, Caleb doing homework nearby, while adult conversations lowered automatically every time he walked into the room. One Wednesday night, Harold spread several printed spreadsheets across the apartment table, while Caleb played video games in his bedroom. You seeing this repetition? Harold asked. Julia leaned closer. The apartment light reflected harshly off the papers. Same transfer amounts? Same routing behavior. He tapped 3 highlighted lines. Different companies. Same movement patterns. That's deliberate. Julia rubbed her forehead. So, what happens now? Harold leaned back carefully in the kitchen chair, which creaked every time he shifted. If corporate auditors connect internal reimbursement fraud to these entities, they'll start tracing ownership structures. And my name pops up. Yep. Julia stared at the table. Outside, somebody downstairs revved an engine inside the tire shop garage before shutting it off again. You still think he believes he can talk his way out of this? Harold snorted softly. People like Emmanuel don't think in terms of consequences first. They think in terms of control. That word followed Julia around lately. Control. The more distance she got from the marriage, the more she saw how much of Emmanuel's personality depended on managing perception. At work, socially, inside the family. Even now, with everything cracking underneath him, he still behaved like presentation mattered more than truth. That became obvious during custody exchanges. He dressed perfectly, smiled at teachers, asked Caleb about school projects in warm, attentive parent voice. Then the second Caleb walked ahead toward the car. Emmanuel's face changed. You've been discussing me with Rachel. Julia blinked. What? She told me you talked. Julia folded Caleb's jacket slowly before answering. She approached me. Emmanuel stepped closer. Stay out of my relationship. Julia almost laughed at the wording, your relationship. Like the affair itself deserved boundaries now. She looked miserable. That's none of your business. You made it my business. His jaw tightened immediately. For a second, Julia thought he might keep arguing, but Caleb came back carrying a science project board half the size of his body. Dad, can you hold this? Emmanuel's expression shifted so fast it barely looked real. Yeah, buddy, I got it. Julia watched him help Caleb load the project into the back seat while discussing volcanoes like nothing else existed. That ability to separate versions of himself used to impress her once. Now it made her uneasy. Meanwhile, Caleb was getting harder to reassure. The divided loyalty inside him showed up everywhere now. His teacher requested a conference after he shoved another kid during recess for making a joke about divorced parents. At home, he started asking strange questions before bed. You think Dad lies on purpose? Or, if people do bad stuff, does that mean they're bad forever? Julia answered carefully every time because she could feel how fragile his understanding of adults had become. One night after homework, Caleb sat cross-legged on the apartment floor, building something out of old Legos while Julia sorted laundry. Dad says courts always favor moms. Julia looked up slowly. Why's he talking to you about court? I don't know. He said sometimes dads lose even when they're better parents. The sentence sounded too old in Caleb's mouth. Julia folded a towel harder than necessary. What did you say? Caleb shrugged. I didn't know what I was supposed to say. That answer hurt more than the actual comment, because no 8-year-old should feel responsible for managing adult emotions that way. Later that night, after Caleb slept, Julia sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at custody paperwork, while guilt pressed against her ribs hard enough to make breathing uncomfortable. Not guilt over leaving Emmanuel. That part had settled. The guilt came from uncertainty. Every decision now felt heavy, pushed too hard legally, and Caleb watched his father collapse. Stay passive, and Emmanuel kept controlling the story. There wasn't a version where Caleb escaped untouched anymore. That realization exhausted her more than money problems did. A few days later, Rachel called, unexpectedly. Julia almost ignored it when the unknown number popped up during lunch break. Instead, she stepped outside behind the medical office near the employee dumpsters and answered cautiously. Hello? Rachel lowered her voice immediately. Can you talk? Julia frowned. What happened? He thinks somebody at work's investigating him. Cold wind pushed loose trash across the pavement. What do you mean investigating? I don't know specifics, Rachel said quickly, but he's paranoid lately. Like, constantly. Julia leaned against the brick wall behind her. Rachel, why are you calling me? Because that part genuinely confused her. There was a long pause before Rachel answered. I think he used me too. The sentence came out strained and embarrassed at the same time. Julia closed her eyes briefly. What happened? He kept asking me to say certain things if anybody contacted me. What things? That business reimbursements were normal. That some accounts were technically family managed. Rachel swallowed audibly. He told me if investigators ever asked questions, I should say you handled parts of the filings. Julia's stomach dropped. What? He said nobody looks twice at the wife. Traffic moved heavily nearby on the main road. Rachel kept talking quickly now, like she needed to get the words out before losing nerve. At first I thought he was exaggerating, like rich finance guy stuff. But lately, she stopped herself. He gets angry whenever I ask questions. Julia stared out toward the parking lot. When did he tell you this? Months ago. Months, meaning Emmanuel discussed using her identity while still trying to negotiate custody arrangements and financial support like a concerned father. Julia pressed her fingers hard against her forehead. Rachel, listen carefully. If anyone contacts you officially, you tell the truth. I know. No, I mean it. I said, I know. Rachel's voice cracked slightly there. Not dramatic. More worn down than anything. Julia suddenly pictured her standing alone somewhere gripping her phone the same way Julia used to during the worst parts of the marriage. The similarity unsettled her. Before hanging up, Rachel spoke again. He keeps saying he can fix everything if people stop overreacting. Julia let out a breath through her nose. That sounded exactly like Emmanuel. After the call ended, she stayed outside another minute, staring at the gray Kentucky sky while her lunch break disappeared. By the time she returned inside, her sandwich sat untouched in the break room fridge. She wasn't hungry anymore anyway. That evening, she told Harold and Linda everything Rachel revealed. Linda stopped writing halfway through. He said that out loud? Apparently. Harold shook his head slowly. He's getting sloppy. Julia looked between them. What if helping expose this destroys Caleb's relationship with his father? Neither answered immediately, because there wasn't a comforting response available. Finally, Linda spoke carefully. You are not responsible for choices Emmanuel made. Julia stared down at the table. Maybe legally that was true. Emotionally, it felt more complicated, because Caleb still loved his father. Even now, especially now, children held on to love stubbornly, long after adults thought they should stop. A week later, the official hearing date finally arrived in the mail. Family Court Division, Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock. Julia stood in the apartment kitchen reading the notice twice while the air conditioner rattled overhead. Caleb sat nearby eating cereal before school. What's that? Court stuff. You nervous? Julia folded the paper carefully. Yeah. Caleb nodded like that made sense. Then, Dad's nervous too. Julia looked at him. How do you know? He yelled at Rachel on the phone yesterday. He said it casually, while spooning cereal into his mouth. Like arguments had slowly become normal background noise in both homes. That realization followed Julia all morning afterward. And late that night, lying awake listening to traffic outside the apartment, she finally admitted something she'd been avoiding for months. This wasn't going to end quietly anymore. Julia woke up before her alarm and immediately felt sick. Not dramatic panic, more physical than emotional. Her stomach tight, mouth dry, chest already bracing for the day before she even got out of bed. Outside the apartment window, the sky still looked dark blue-gray. Early spring rain hit the glass in soft, uneven taps, while traffic moved faintly below. She sat on the edge of the mattress for a minute, staring at the floor. Then Caleb knocked lightly on her bedroom door. You awake? Yeah. He stepped inside, wearing pajama pants and one sock. You forgot to sign my field trip form. Julia blinked a couple times, trying to pull herself fully into the moment. Sorry. Bring it here. He handed over the crumpled paper. You nervous about court? Kids heard everything eventually. Julia signed the form carefully. A little. You gonna win? The question landed wrong immediately because it reminded her how children viewed adult conflict sometimes. Simple winners, simple losers. She handed the paper back. I'm gonna tell the truth. Caleb considered that answer seriously. Then, okay. After he left for school with Denise, Julia got dressed slowly in the tiny apartment bathroom. Black slacks, low heels, the only blazer she owned. She'd bought it years earlier for a dental office holiday party and hadn't worn it since. The sleeves felt tighter now. By 8:30 she sat beside Linda inside the courthouse hallway, holding coffee she couldn't drink. Families filled the benches around them. Custody hearings, support disputes, protective orders. One toddler screamed because somebody took his crackers. A teenage girl cried silently beside her grandmother near the elevators. Some guy in work boots argued into his phone about parking validation. Life falling apart looked surprisingly ordinary up close. Linda reviewed notes one final time. Answer only what's asked. Julia nodded. Do not interrupt opposing counsel, even if they provoke you. Another nod. And breathe. I am breathing. Barely. Across the hallway, Emmanuel arrived with his attorney. He looked polished as ever. Dark suit, fresh haircut, calm expression. But underneath it, Julia noticed things she wouldn't have recognized months earlier. The stiffness in his shoulders, how fast he checked his phone, the tightness around his mouth when he thought nobody watched him. He glanced toward her briefly. No smile, no nod, just assessment. Then he walked into the courtroom. The hearing started at 9:15. The courtroom itself felt smaller than Julia expected. Too warm. Beige walls. Fluorescent lighting harsh enough to make everyone look exhausted. She sat beside Linda, trying not to move her knee constantly. Emmanuel sat across the aisle. The judge reviewed preliminary custody issues first, before financial concerns entered discussion. For almost 30 minutes, everything sounded painfully procedural. School structure, parenting schedules, living arrangements. Then, Emmanuel's attorney stood. We would also like the court to consider concerns regarding Mrs. Carter's instability during this period. Julia's stomach tightened immediately. Linda stayed expressionless beside her. The attorney continued smoothly. Mrs. Carter currently works multiple inconsistent jobs, has relocated to temporary housing, and has demonstrated emotionally reactive behavior throughout mediation. Emotionally reactive. Julia almost laughed from disbelief. Linda rose calmly. Single income adjustment after marital separation is not evidence of parental instability. We're discussing overall environment. No, Linda answered evenly. You're attempting to penalize the parent who sacrificed career advancement during the marriage. The judge looked unimpressed with both attorneys equally. Stick to specifics. Emmanuel's attorney nodded. Of course, Your Honor. Then came the part that made Julia's pulse spike. There are also unresolved questions regarding financial entities connected to Mrs. Carter's name. Julia physically felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Linda sat forward immediately. Your Honor, the attorney kept going. Several business filings and associated accounts appeared jointly tied to Mrs. Carter. The courtroom suddenly sounded distant to Julia. Air conditioner humming, paper shuffling, someone coughing in the back row. Linda objected sharply this time. Counsel is implying misconduct without context or formal findings. We're discussing financial judgment. No, Linda shot back. You're attempting intimidation. The judge raised a hand before either attorney escalated further. Enough. Julia stared straight ahead, trying not to visibly panic. Across the room, Emmanuel avoided looking at her completely. That hurt more than she expected. Not because she wanted support from him anymore, because he was willing to let suspicion settle around her publicly if it protected himself. The judge turned toward Linda. Do you intend to address these financial connections? Linda stood slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Extensively. Something in her tone made Emmanuel finally look up, and for the first time that morning, Julia saw uncertainty flicker across his face. Linda approached the evidence table carrying organized binders Harold helped prepare. Mrs. Carter's name appears attached to multiple entities created and operated during the marriage without her informed participation. She handed documents to the clerk. We can demonstrate repeated filings executed while Mrs. Carter was either absent, working unrelated jobs, or physically documented elsewhere. The judge reviewed pages carefully. Linda continued. These include electronic signatures time-stamped during periods where Mrs. Carter lacked account access and, in some instances, was verifiably not present. Emmanuel shifted in his seat now, subtle movement, but visible. Linda kept building slowly. Travel records, archived login data, corporate reimbursement chains, nothing dramatic, which somehow made it more devastating. Piece by piece, the version Emmanuel presented started developing cracks. His attorney interrupted repeatedly, trying to slow momentum. Speculation, incomplete interpretation, no formal criminal finding, but the evidence itself kept accumulating. Julia answered questions when asked. Yes, Emmanuel managed most financial accounts. Yes, she signed documents during the marriage without full review. No, she did not create or operate the listed companies independently. Her voice steadied the longer she spoke, because facts felt simpler than emotion now. Then Rachel walked into the courtroom. Julia actually thought for a second she might have imagined her. Rachel wore a dark sweater and looked pale enough that even courtroom lighting couldn't hide it. Emmanuel froze visibly when he saw her. Not anger first, fear. His attorney turned immediately. Your Honor, we were not informed. Linda stood. Rebuttal witness. Rachel sat down carefully and clasped both hands together so tightly, her knuckles whitened. The courtroom shifted after that. Everybody could feel it. Rachel answered quietly at first. Yes, she worked with Emmanuel. Yes, they had a personal relationship. Yes, he discussed financial concerns with her repeatedly during the past year. Emmanuel stared at the table while she spoke. Then Rachel said, he told me if anybody asked questions, I should say Julia handled parts of the filings because spouses signed things all the time. The room went completely still for one long second. Even Emmanuel's attorney looked caught off guard. Rachel swallowed hard before continuing. He said nobody looks twice at the wife. Julia closed her eyes briefly. Hearing the sentence out loud in court felt different than hearing it privately over the phone. Permanent, somehow. The attorney tried recovering immediately. Miss Rachel, are you aware of the legal seriousness of these accusations? Yes. Are you acting out of personal resentment following relationship difficulties? Rachel looked exhausted. I'm acting because I got scared. That answer landed harder than any dramatic speech could have, because it sounded true. The judge reviewed several pages silently while the courtroom waited. Across the aisle, Emmanuel finally looked toward Julia directly, and for the first time since she met him, he looked genuinely rattled. Not annoyed, not frustrated, not emotionally inconvenienced. Scared. Julia expected satisfaction when that moment finally came. Instead, she mostly felt tired, because sitting there watching the father of her child realize control was slipping away didn't feel victorious. It felt sad and dangerous. The first article showed up online 3 weeks later. Nothing huge. A local business journal piece about internal financial irregularities inside Emmanuel's company. No arrest. No formal accusation yet, but the wording alone was enough. Julia found it accidentally while searching school closings during a thunderstorm. She stared at the headline from the apartment couch, while Caleb built a science project volcano on the coffee table using glue that smelled like chemicals. Corporate audit expands following reimbursement concerns. Emmanuel's name appeared halfway down the article, not highlighted dramatically, buried inside paragraphs about vendor relationships and financial review procedures. Still, it was there. Caleb looked up from his project. What? Julia locked her phone immediately. Nothing. You made the face. What face? The stressed face. Children noticed patterns adults thought they hid well. Julia set the phone face down beside her. Your volcano's leaning. Caleb looked horrified and rushed to fix it. By then, Emmanuel's company had already started distancing itself publicly. His corporate bio disappeared from the website first. Then his LinkedIn suddenly changed to transitioning into independent consulting opportunities. Denise sent Julia screenshots one evening with the message, "Girl, this man is sinking." Julia never responded, because none of it felt entertaining from inside the situation. At custody exchanges, Emmanuel looked thinner every week. The polished version of him still existed technically. Pressed shirts, expensive watch, controlled posture. But pressure leaked through now. Dark circles under his eyes, shorter temper, phone constantly vibrating. One Friday afternoon, he arrived 20 minutes late picking up Caleb from school. Caleb sat beside Julia in the parking lot, kicking the back of her seat softly. Dad forgot again? He's probably stuck in traffic. But even she didn't believe it fully. When Emmanuel finally pulled in, he climbed out too fast and nearly forgot to close his driver's side door. Sorry, he muttered. No explanation, no performance. Caleb grabbed his backpack slowly. You okay? The question surprised all three of them. Emmanuel looked at his son for a second before answering. Yeah, buddy, just busy. But his voice sounded strained enough that even Caleb noticed. That night, Caleb called around 9:30. Julia answered immediately. Hey, baby. Dad's acting weird. Her stomach tightened. What happened? He keeps pacing. In the background, she heard television noise low and muffled, and Rachel left. Julia sat up straighter on the couch. What do you mean, left? I don't know. Her bags were by the door. A pause. Dad yelled after her in the driveway. Julia closed her eyes briefly. Are you safe? Yeah, okay. Put Dad on the phone. There was movement, muffled voices. Then Emmanuel answered, sounding exhausted and irritated simultaneously. What? Caleb called, upset. He's fine. What happened with Rachel? That's none of your business. Maybe not. But our son's listening to screaming matches. Emmanuel exhaled sharply. You always do this. Do what? Act like I'm dangerous. Julia stood and walked toward the apartment window automatically. Rain streaked the glass outside. You grabbed Rachel hard enough to scare Caleb. Silence, briefly. Then she told you that? Caleb saw it. Emmanuel didn't answer immediately. When he spoke again, his voice sounded lower. You think you know everything now. No, I think you're unraveling. That landed. She could hear it land. His breathing changed slightly. Then he said, Put Caleb back on. The line clicked dead a few seconds later. 2 days after that, Rachel disappeared completely from Emmanuel's social media. No photos, no tagged dinners, nothing. By Monday morning, Denise texted, pretty sure she moved back to Ohio. Julia stared at the message while standing in line at Kroger, holding generic cereal and paper towels. The cashier asked twice whether she wanted cash back before Julia answered. Meanwhile, rumors spread quietly through the old neighborhood. People stopped mentioning Emmanuel casually. Mutual friends grew awkward. A couple who used to invite both of them to cookouts suddenly stopped contacting either one. Funny how fast social circles vanished once money and status stopped making someone useful. Then federal investigators officially entered the picture, not publicly at first. Harold called Julia one evening while she cleaned exam rooms after hours at the medical office. "You sitting down?" "No. Why?" "You should probably sit down." Julia lowered herself onto a rolling stool beside the supply cabinet. "What happened?" "Corporate audit findings got referred upward." Her chest tightened. "Meaning?" "Meaning somebody." Federal's reviewing financial movement now. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Julia stared at disinfectant wipes stacked beside the sink. "Am the first being investigated?" "Not from what I'm hearing." "Not reassuring, Harold." "I know." He lowered his voice. "Listen carefully. Don't destroy documents. Don't contact Emmanuel about any of this directly. And if attorneys reach out formally, you cooperate fully." Julia nodded, even though he couldn't see her. After the call ended, she sat there longer than she meant to while somebody vacuumed the hallway outside. At some point, her manager poked her head into the room. "You okay?" Julia blinked. "Yeah, sorry. You look pale. Long day." That answer covered almost everything lately. A week before summer break started, Emmanuel showed up outside Julia's apartment unexpectedly. No warning text, no custody exchange scheduled. Julia had just gotten Caleb into bed after a nightmare about tornado sirens when headlights swept across the apartment window. She looked outside and immediately recognized Emmanuel's BMW parked crooked beside the curb. Her stomach dropped. A hard knock hit the door before she even reached it. Julia opened it, halfway. "What are you doing here?" Emmanuel looked rough. Not drunk, not disheveled, but worn down in a way she'd never seen before. His tie hung loose. His eyes looked bloodshot from lack of sleep. "You've been talking to people." Julia kept one hand on the door. "It's 10:30. You think I don't know what you're doing?" "Lower your voice." "I'm serious." Caleb shifted faintly in the bedroom down the hall. Julia stepped outside immediately and pulled the apartment door mostly shut behind her. The humid night air smelled like rain and motor oil from the tire shop below. "What do you want?" Emmanuel laughed once, under his breath. "You're helping destroy me." "No, your decisions are doing that. You fed information to Rachel. She came to me. You turned her against me." Julia stared at him. "She's scared of you." That sentence visibly hit something raw. Emmanuel stepped closer. "You have no idea what's happening." "Then explain it." "I'm being set up internally." Julia almost couldn't believe he was still trying that. "With fake companies under my name. I protected this family for years. You used this family." His jaw flexed hard. "You think you're innocent in all this?" The shift in tone made her pulse jump immediately. There it was, the threat underneath everything else. "I didn't know what you were doing." "That's convenient." Julia folded her arms tightly across herself. "You forged signatures. I handled paperwork. You hid accounts. I managed finances because somebody had to." The old arrogance flashed there again briefly. Same tone, same belief that competence erased morality. Then Emmanuel looked directly at her and said the sentence she would remember for years afterward. "If I go down for this, you go down too." The parking lot suddenly felt very small. A dog barked somewhere across the street. Inside the apartment, pipes knocked softly in the walls. Julia stared at him carefully, and weirdly, hearing the threat out loud changed something important. Because for months, she'd still carried pieces of confusion about who Emmanuel really was underneath all this. The husband she built a life with, the father who coached Caleb's soccer team, the man who used to fall asleep beside her on Sunday afternoons during football games. But standing there outside the apartment while he threatened her to protect himself, the last of that confusion finally burned away. "You're not scared about losing me," she said softly. Emmanuel frowned. "You're scared about losing control." For a second, neither moved. Then Emmanuel shook his head sharply, like he physically rejected the idea. "You always make everything emotional." "No," Julia answered. "I just finally see you clearly." His face hardened immediately after that. Not rage exactly. Worse. Emptiness. Then he stepped backward toward his car. This isn't over. Julia didn't answer. She waited until he drove away before going back inside. Caleb was standing in the hallway rubbing one eye sleepily. Was that Dad? Julia looked at her son for a long moment, standing in the hallway rubbing one eye sleepily. Was that Dad? Julia looked at her son for a long moment before speaking. Yeah. Why was he mad? She knelt carefully in front of him. Because sometimes adults make bad choices and don't know what to do after. Caleb absorbed that silently. Then he leaned forward and wrapped both arms around her neck. Julia held him there in the dim apartment hallway, while the old air conditioner rattled overhead. And for the first time in months, she realized she was less afraid of Emmanuel than she used to be. 2 years later, Julia still woke up too early sometimes, usually around 4:30. No alarm, no obvious reason. Her body had simply gotten used to listening for problems. She'd lie there in the dark apartment for a minute, staring at the ceiling fan, while old anxiety moved through her automatically. Did I pay the electric bill? Did Caleb finish that school form? Did I answer Linda's email? Did something happen overnight? Then slowly, reality would catch up. The court hearings were over. The investigations were no longer rumors. Emmanuel wasn't showing up unexpectedly outside her apartment anymore. Most mornings after that realization settled in, Julia rolled over and went back to sleep for another hour. That counted as progress now. By then she and Caleb had moved into a better apartment across town, near a small public park, and an elementary school that smelled permanently like crayons and cafeteria pizza. Still modest, but cleaner, safer, quieter. The windows didn't rattle during storms anymore, and nobody downstairs used industrial tire compressors at 7 in the morning. Caleb was 13 now, taller every month, voice changing unevenly, eating enough food to financially ruin a person. One Tuesday evening, Julia stood at the stove making tacos while Caleb sat at the counter doing algebra homework with a level of personal suffering usually associated with hostage situations. This should count as child abuse, he muttered. You said that about science yesterday, because school's basically a scam. Julia laughed while flipping tortillas. That sound still surprised her sometimes, not because she never laughed during the hard years, but back then, laughter always felt temporary, like it had to squeeze itself between stress. Now it showed up naturally again. Caleb dropped his pencil dramatically. Why do letters even need to be in math? Excellent question. Unfortunately, I don't run the education system. You'd probably do better than whoever does. Low bar. Outside the kitchen window, rain tapped softly against the glass while traffic moved steadily through the intersection below. Ordinary evening. Homework. Dinner cooking. A basketball game. Playing quietly from the living room television. The kind of normal Julia used to overlook, before learning how exhausting tension could become when it lived inside a house long enough. Back during the marriage, she'd spent years monitoring emotional weather without fully realizing it. How stressed was Emmanuel today? Was he irritated, distracted, withdrawn? She adjusted herself constantly around those moods. Smaller comments, careful timing, avoiding certain topics late at night. At the time, it felt like compromise. Looking back, it felt more like gradual disappearance. Mom? Julia blinked back toward the kitchen. What? You burned one. Sure enough, smoke curled lightly from a forgotten tortilla. Damn it. Caleb grinned for the first time all evening. See? You're distracted too. Yeah, well, my distractions pay rent. Barely. Julia pointed the spatula toward him. Careful. I can still ground you. You say that like you have energy. Honestly, fair point. Money still stayed tight. That part never magically fixed itself. Julia eventually moved from reception work into full-time office management at the medical practice after the owner retired and younger staff kept quitting every 6 months. The raise helped. So did fewer cleaning shifts at night. But financial recovery happened slowly when you rebuilt from almost nothing in your 30s, especially with legal bills still hanging around for over a year afterward. Sometimes she still caught herself panicking automatically while grocery shopping, checking prices too carefully, calculating totals in her head before reaching the register. Trauma had habits. Even now, Julia kept an emergency envelope hidden in the back of her dresser with cash inside because losing stability once changed how your brain treated safety afterward. Across the counter, Caleb looked up from his homework. You got that face again. What face? The thinking too hard face. Julia slid tacos onto plates. I'm thinking about bills. You always pay bills. Unfortunately, companies insist on it. Caleb snorted. Teenagers laughed differently than little kids. Less open, more accidental. Still good, though. They ate dinner at the small kitchen table beside the window while rain thickened outside. Halfway through the meal, Caleb started telling a story about a kid at school who accidentally called a teacher mom in class and tried pretending it never happened. Julia laughed hard enough, she almost dropped her fork. Oh no. He tried to cough over it. That makes it worse. I know. For a second, Caleb laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. And sitting there watching him, Julia realized how long it had been since she'd seen him fully relaxed without checking the emotional temperature of the room first. That healing mattered more than almost anything else. Even after all this time, though, pieces of the old fear still surfaced unexpectedly. A knock at the door after dark sometimes made her heart jump. Unknown phone numbers irritated her immediately. Once, during tax season, she physically shook opening a certified envelope before realizing it was completely unrelated paperwork from the state education department. Those reactions embarrassed her occasionally, but Harold told her something during one of their rare coffee visits after the investigation settled. Your nervous system spent years learning instability, he said. People don't switch that off overnight. Harold aged noticeably over those 2 years too. Slower walking, more doctor appointments, still stubborn. Federal charges against Emmanuel eventually became public record after months of investigation and negotiations. Fraud, financial misconduct, corporate embezzlement. No dramatic televised arrest like movies. Mostly paperwork, court appearances, and local headlines people forgot faster than Julia expected. That part surprised her. She used to think scandals changed the world permanently. In reality, most people moved on once newer gossip arrived. Caleb struggled with it longer, especially after classmates started overhearing parents talking. One afternoon he came home angry after school and slammed his backpack against the wall hard enough to leave a mark. You want to tell me what happened? He crossed his arms tightly. Nothing. Okay. Julia kept unloading groceries calmly. 3 minutes later, some kid said Dad's a criminal. There it was. Julia closed the refrigerator carefully. What did you do? Punched him. Caleb, he said at first. That doesn't help. Caleb's face twisted somewhere between anger and embarrassment. He doesn't even know Dad. Julia walked closer slowly. Hey, Caleb looked away. You can love somebody and still be hurt by what they did. I know. No, I mean both things can exist together. He rubbed hard at one eye with his sleeve. I hate talking about him at school. Julia nodded. That makes sense. Caleb looked younger, suddenly standing there in the kitchen trying to carry emotions too complicated for 13. Do you hate him? The question came quietly. Julia answered honestly, because he deserved that much by now. No. Caleb frowned slightly, like he didn't expect that answer. I don't trust him, Julia continued, and I'm angry about things that happened, but hate takes a lot of energy. He thought about that, while staring at the floor. Then, I think I still miss old Dad sometimes. Julia felt her chest tighten, because she missed pieces of that version too, once, even knowing parts of it weren't real. That's normal, she said softly. And it was. That was the complicated truth nobody explained to children during divorces. People didn't transform entirely overnight into monsters or victims. Sometimes the same person who coached soccer games and made Saturday pancakes also lied, manipulated, and destroyed trust. Human beings were uncomfortable that way. Later that evening, after Caleb went to bed, Julia stepped onto the apartment balcony holding a mug of tea she'd forget to drink. The rain finally stopped. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement below while distant traffic hummed through the city. For years, nights used to feel like waiting for arguments, waiting for financial panic, waiting for emotional fallout. Standing there now, Julia realized something simple but important. Nobody in her life controlled the emotional atmosphere of her home anymore, and after everything that happened, that peace felt almost unfamiliar at first. The ice cream came from a gas station off River Road because Caleb insisted the bad places always had better snacks. Julia didn't argue. It was Saturday afternoon, Warm enough for people to crowd the walking trails near the river, but not miserable yet. Kids rode scooters along the sidewalk, while couples pushed strollers past the water. Caleb sat on the hood of Julia's car, holding a melting chocolate cone, and watching barges move slowly down the Ohio River. At 13, he'd entered that awkward stage where he looked half-grown one day and 12 years old again the next. His knees stuck out too far from his jeans. His voice cracked randomly. He ate like somebody preparing for hibernation. "You got napkins?" he asked. Julia handed him a stack from the gas station bag. "You're already losing the battle." "I eat aggressively. That's one word for it." He grinned slightly. For a while, they sat there without talking much. Not uncomfortable, just normal. Wind moved softly across the water, carrying that muddy river smell Louisville always had in summer. Nearby, somebody played music low from a parked truck. A dog barked every 30 seconds at absolutely nothing. Caleb licked ice cream off his thumb thoughtfully. "Mom?" "Yeah." "Were you scared back then?" Julia looked over at him. The question sounded casual at first, but she knew better by now. Kids usually circled difficult things before landing directly on them. Back when, you know, he gestured vaguely with the cone, the divorce stuff. Julia leaned against the car beside him. "Honestly, yeah, all the time." Caleb stared out toward the river again. "Then why didn't you stop?" "Stop what?" "Fighting Dad." Julia let out a slow breath through her nose. Because there it was, the question underneath the question. She took a second before answering. "I wasn't trying to fight him forever. But you still went to court and everything. Because some things mattered too much not to." Caleb scraped melting ice cream from the side of the cone absently. "You thought he'd take me?" Julia considered lying. "Didn't. I thought he might try. He says he never would have." "That's probably true from his perspective." Caleb frowned immediately. "What's that mean?" Julia searched for words carefully. "When adults are hurting or scared, they tell themselves stories that make their decisions feel reasonable." "That sounds confusing." "It is confusing." He laughed once at that. Then, "Dad always talks like he was trying to protect everybody." Julia looked out at the water. "That's because people usually want to believe they're the good guy in their own life." "You think he's a bad guy?" There was no clean answer available there either. Julia rested both elbows behind her against the warm hood of the car. "I think your dad spent a long time believing money solved everything." Caleb listened closely now. "Like what?" "Like control, security, power." She shrugged lightly. He thought if he earned enough, planned enough, managed enough, he could control outcomes. Caleb kicked one sneaker against the bumper thoughtfully. "And he couldn't?" "No." A speedboat moved loudly across the river, leaving white water behind it. Julia watched it for a second, before continuing. "The problem is, money can help people. Of course it can, but it can also make somebody believe they never have to admit when they're wrong." Caleb nodded slowly. "I used to think rich adults had life figured out." Julia laughed softly. "Oh, absolutely not. You don't think money matters?" "It matters." She answered that immediately. Anybody saying it doesn't is usually somebody who's never struggled. Caleb glanced sideways at her. "We struggled." "Yeah. You still scared about money?" Julia smiled a little at how direct teenagers could become once they stopped filtering themselves. "Sometimes, even now, especially now sometimes." He looked surprised by that. Julia folded her napkin smaller between her fingers. "When you lose stability once, your brain remembers it." Caleb was quiet after that, not withdrawn, thinking. Then, "I remember you crying in the bathroom one time." Julia froze briefly. He kept staring toward the river while talking. "I wasn't supposed to hear it." She swallowed carefully. "You were little. I still remember." Of course he did. Children remembered more than adults wanted them to. Julia looked down at her half-melted vanilla cone. "I'm sorry." Caleb frowned. "Why?" "Because you shouldn't have had to carry all that. You carried it." The simplicity of that answer hit harder than she expected. Julia looked over at him again. He wasn't a little boy anymore. Not fully. The past few years had stretched him emotionally in ways she hated sometimes, but they'd also made him observant, more than either parent probably realized. "You know," Caleb said slowly, "I used to think Dad was the strong one." Julia raised an eyebrow. "Because he made more money?" "Yeah, And he always acted confident. She nodded once. That stuff looks powerful from the outside. Caleb scraped the last bit of ice cream from the cone. But you stayed. Julia frowned slightly. What do you mean? You know, through all of it. He shrugged awkwardly, embarrassed by his own sincerity now. I think that's harder. For a second, Julia couldn't speak. Because children sometimes understood things adults overcomplicated for years. Not perfectly, but enough. She reached over and nudged his shoulder lightly. Well, don't get too inspirational on me. Caleb rolled his eyes immediately. Never mind then. There he is. He smiled despite himself. The sun started lowering gradually behind the buildings across the river, turning the water orange in uneven patches. People nearby packed folding chairs into SUVs. Joggers passed with headphones in. Some little girl dropped an entire snow cone and reacted like civilization ended. Ordinary life moving around them. And sitting there beside Caleb with sticky fingers and gas station napkins blowing across the parking lot, Julia realized something she probably should have understood earlier. Strength rarely looked impressive while it was happening. Most of the time, it looked like exhaustion, routine, getting up again because somebody still needed dinner and rides to school and clean laundry. Caleb tossed his napkin toward the trash bag in the back seat and missed completely. Nice shot, Julia said. Wind interference. You were 3 feet away. Still counts. She laughed again, and hearing him laugh back without tension underneath it felt like one of the few things in life that still healed something every time it happened. A few months after Caleb turned 14, Julia found an old storage bin while cleaning out the hall closet. Mostly random things inside. Christmas decorations, expired coupons, school drawings Caleb made in 2nd grade, where every person looked shaped like a potato. Near the bottom sat an old photo album she hadn't opened in years. Julia carried it into the living room and sat cross-legged on the couch, flipping through pages slowly, while rain tapped against the windows outside. There they were, vacation pictures, birthday dinners, the backyard swing set Emmanuel built one summer while complaining the entire weekend about missing bolts and bad instructions. Julia smiled despite herself looking at that one. For a long time after the divorce, she avoided old photographs completely because she thought they'd only remind her how badly she'd been fooled. But age softened certain things. Not forgiveness exactly, more perspective. Some moments inside that marriage were real. Caleb learning to ride a bike, movie nights on the couch. Emmanuel falling asleep, holding a half-finished beer during football season. People were complicated enough to create genuine memories while still causing deep damage later. That truth took Julia years to accept properly. The front door opened around 6:30. Why's it smell like old paper in here? Caleb called. Julia laughed. Because I found ancient artifacts. He dropped his backpack beside the couch and immediately leaned over the album. Oh God, what? You gave me bowl-cut bangs. You were 5. I looked unemployed. Julia laughed harder at that than she expected. Caleb sat beside her flipping pages. There's Dad. Yup. Neither spoke for a second after that. Not tense, just aware. By then, Emmanuel was living in a smaller apartment outside Lexington after taking a plea agreement tied to financial misconduct and fraud charges. No prison sentence as long as restitution payments continued and probation terms were followed. The newspapers stopped caring months earlier. Most people did. Caleb still visited occasionally, though less often now that he was older and saw things more clearly himself. Their relationship had become cautious, careful, like both father and son were still trying to figure out what survived after trust changed shape. You ever regret marrying him? Caleb asked suddenly. Julia looked down at the photo album. That question deserved honesty too. No. He looked surprised. Seriously? Yeah. After everything? Julia leaned back against the couch slowly. If I didn't marry your dad, I wouldn't have you. Caleb immediately made a face. That's emotionally manipulative. It's true, though. He rolled his eyes, but smiled anyway. Julia turned another page carefully. You know what I actually regret? What? She thought about it before answering, because the truth mattered. I regret how much of myself I handed away slowly. Caleb frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means... Julia searched for words. I got so focused on keeping everything stable that I stopped noticing how dependent I was becoming. He listened without interrupting. That doesn't happen all at once, she continued. It's gradual. Somebody handles the taxes because they're better at it. Then the investments. Then the big decisions. And then one day you realize you haven't been steering your own life in years. Caleb looked down at one of the old vacation photos. You trusted him. Completely. The room settled around that admission for a second. Rain continued softly outside, while headlights passed through the apartment blinds in moving strips. Julia closed the album halfway. I used to think being a good wife meant making myself smaller whenever life got stressful. Caleb raised an eyebrow. That sounds terrible. Yeah, turns out it was. He laughed quietly through his nose. Then you're different now. Julia looked over at him. How? You say what you think faster. That sounds dangerous. It kinda is. She nudged his shoulder lightly. But he wasn't wrong. The old version of herself spent years managing tension before it happened, anticipating moods, avoiding conflict, translating her own needs into softer language so nobody felt challenged by them. Now she asked direct questions, checked every financial document herself, kept savings in her own account, said no without apologizing for 20 minutes afterward, not because she became hard, because survival taught her softness without boundaries eventually turns into surrender. Caleb stood and stretched. You making dinner, or are we eating photo albums? Depends. You want seasoning? Please, never say that again. Julia laughed and followed him toward the kitchen. While preheating the oven, she caught her reflection faintly in the microwave door. Older now, more tired around the eyes maybe, but steadier. That was the word for it. Steadier. The affair hurt. The custody fight hurt. Watching Emmanuel unravel in public hurt too, even after everything. People imagined betrayal created clean emotions. Usually it didn't. There were still moments Julia remembered the man she loved before all this happened, and wondered where exactly he disappeared to, or whether that version ever fully existed outside the life she built around him. But she stopped needing perfect answers eventually. That helped, because in the end, the deepest damage hadn't been the cheating, or even the financial manipulation. It was how thoroughly she convinced herself survival depended on keeping Emmanuel comfortable, successful, and emotionally centered at all times. She built entire years around preserving stability that was never fully hers to begin with, and when everything collapsed, she discovered something difficult but important. Fear could shrink a person slowly without them noticing. So could love when it lost balance. Later that night, after Caleb disappeared into his room wearing headphones and complaining loudly about homework, Julia stepped onto the apartment balcony with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The rain finally stopped. Below, traffic moved steadily through the wet streets while somebody nearby laughed too loudly getting out of a rideshare. Normal life. Messy, unimpressive, still moving. Julia leaned against the railing and breathed in cool, damp air. For years she thought strength looked like holding everything together, no matter what it cost her. Now she understood it differently. Strength was telling the truth, once denial became easier. Strength was rebuilding slowly, without turning cruel. Strength was raising a son who still believed honesty mattered after watching adults fail each other badly. And maybe most importantly, strength was learning you could survive losing the life you thought protected you. Because the strange thing was, after everything Emmanuel took apart, Julia finally trusted herself more than she ever trusted him, and that ended up mattering more than the marriage ever did. If this story hit you in any way, let me know down in the comments. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you ignored the warning signs until it was too late? And honestly, do you think Julia made the right choice fighting for Caleb, even when she could have walked away with financial security? Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Mr. Graham Stories, and turn on notifications if you want more real-life stories about family, betrayal, survival, and the difficult choices people make behind closed doors. And remember, sometimes the hardest thing a person can do is rebuild their life without losing themselves in the process.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham Stories, my beautiful, amazing family.